Yesterday was my 77th birthday. And, birthdays are attention getters, but there's something about the sibilance of 77, and the balance of it. And coming in the midst of these very painful and testing times that we're all dealing with. So, what does it mean to be 77? Also, I have been giving so much thought to this idea of the 50th anniversary. Well, the 50th anniversary of what? At a certain level, the 50th anniversary of my starting an organization, Stavros, that still bears my brother's name. Though it saddens me what they have devolved to, though it is a condition that certainly a great many centers for independent living have fallen into. And that is that I believe that there was a time in the development of the disability movement when centers for independent living were needed. We needed an organizing base. We were a community without, any handholds, footholds, toeholds, and organizationally to build on. So this form was invented, the Center for Independent Living, and it proliferated and was just beginning to proliferate 50 years ago. For as best we can calculate, I can calculate, we were arguably the second in the country. Two in Massachusetts were arguably, can contest for which was the second. The Boston Center for Independent Living, there in the eastern part of the state, and Stavros out here in Western Mass. But is that it? Is it the 50th anniversary of the organization? I was 27. 27. That's a good age to find a sense of mission, because the organization only grew out of my being concerned with what was I going to do. It was time to take on something useful in the world. That was the impulse, and that impulse was guided by a particular reading of a Buddhist text, the Dhammapada, and a segment in it that spoke to me about the need for discipline in one's life. Assuming I had always been the kind of flaky on the edges, ad liber, but now, having been paralyzed 7 years earlier, there's 7 again. Are we being numerological? I'm not a numerology guy, but it has a certain poetry to it. So in my 7th year of this transformed way of living, I found my sense of mission, driven by eroticism. I was in love. I had met Noreen Hessian. We were living together in an apartment in Amherst and Rolling Green on a Section 8 subsidy in Amherst. And somewhere in that process, I wrote to the Internal Revenue Service and incorporated a nonprofit, but seriously not having a clue what I was doing. Well, exaggeration again. The clue was that I had been to Big Sur, California, and for 4 months had been both delighted by and benefited from the wonderful bodywork disciplines being practiced at Esalen Institute. First among them for me being structural integration, the deep connective tissue work that helped overcome a great deal of contraction and basically limitations on my breathing that had grown out of the initial trauma and years of recovery. So I had an idea, a nonprofit out of Western Mass. I would find some way of communicating to the world of medical rehabilitation this better way of doing things. I could say a lot about what the experience of rehabilitation was. How peculiar. There was physical rehab, wonderful physical therapists who dealt with teaching very, very basic things. First of all, was coming to a new adjustment and way of dealing with gravity, right? How to get in and out of a wheelchair, how to get on and off a sitting surface. All of that was about balancing in a field of gravity. It's a striking experience to realize what you had always taken absolutely for granted. Unself-consciously adjusting the way you stood by those little corrections that people make in your toe muscles, that no longer worked. If one did not consciously deal with the balance of the weight of the body over its own structures and how you move that through space, you very quickly end up on the ground. Boom! The experience of falling. Well, I had learned those basic lessons. They weren't, terribly sophisticated, but I learned them. I learned how to push a chair, and I learned how to get with good brother, another person in the chair, and go out and do misadventures around the city of Boston. I was on my way, but now what was the possibility of working out a new way of life? I had gone off to Esalen. I had found things that were really wonderful physically. I also found things that really spoke to the mystic within me, to my own inclinations towards the spiritual life. That is meditation practice, that all of this work and the opening of breathing, was about the focus of concentration and putting intention on each of those breaths. So my intention was I was a child of the 60s. You should supposed to go out and make the world a better place. And for me, as someone who had begun very drawn to the civil rights movement, as a white boy drawn to the civil rights movement, now as difficult as the experience had been, I had found not yet what I thought of as a community, but I certainly found a kind of a realm of purpose, that is working with people with disabilities similar to mine, physical disabilities. So I incorporated this nonprofit. I wrote to the IRS. God knows what I said initially. I used the language of a rehabilitation project. I put this thing together. I wrote a first little proposal, and I started traveling from Western Mass to Boston to go back to the Boston area, which is where medical rehabilitation was. There was nothing in Western Mass at the time. And I quickly discovered that the folks who did a good bit of this felt that we were at a really transitional moment. That something very new was happening. And it was called independent living, that there was going to be the movement towards a new kind of rehabilitation. That rather than seeing that the goal was getting a job and everything following from that. If you had a disability, if you got a job, then you could get better housing and deal with other things in your life. But for people with more complicated levels of disability, that wasn't going to work. Before you could get the job, you had to know how you were going to get out of bed in the morning. You had to know how you were going to actually secure a place to live that was going to work for you. Now, in the gradients of disability that march along the spinal cord, I passed for a para, or I did at the time. I've been deteriorating in recent years, but I had enough hand function, enough arm strength. I could drive, I could transfer myself, I could live independently. I quickly learned that the work that had to be done was for people whose disabilities were more complicated than mine. People with higher levels of injury, less use of hands and arms, less ability to function independently. So that's what we set out to do. I connected with Boston, and I made quite a splash. I was a different kind of character from Western Mass. Some said I was a hippie. I did. I had my long hair, and I had a propensity to imbibe cannabis, and I would wear I had these flame orange pants that someone had made for me with a drawstring, and a fabulous Indonesian fabric shirt that had been made by my friend Nancy, and I looked like a hippie. And I went on into Boston, but I was a liberally educated hippie with a Wesleyan a Wesleyan degree, and lib, and a kind of a flippant intellectual as well. Not just an intellectual, but political, historical, civil rights, and a hippie package, and the rest of this. So I was warmly received. And actually, I told Monet one of my very, very favorite stories. Okay. I get to meet the crowd in Boston. They take due note that somebody new has arrived from Western Mass. The Commissioner of Rehabilitation, Russell O'Connell. And Russell is a barrel-chested ex-Marine anti-poverty warrior. He wasn't a rehab guy, he was an anti-poverty guy who happened to be commissioner of rehab. But he invites me to my first meeting of consumer leaders, that was the term, in his office in Boston. So I go into Russell's office, and here is his desk, and framed on one side by the flag of the United States, the other side by the flag of the Commonwealth, and then there is a table for about 3 people on each side in the end. I know I take the position, of course, directly opposite, the commissioner, and these other consumer leaders come in and sit down, and we go through an excruciatingly, was it boring? And it was vague. I didn't, what was the point of what they were talking about? It was just people who got together and did these meetings that I couldn't see any particular point to them. About 10 days later, I was in Boston again, and I went in to see Russell, and the dude asked me, he said, "So what did you think of the meeting?" And I said, "Russell, I was really impressed by your cigar." He laughs. One of the things I'm learning with Russell is he gets my sense of humor. "Russell, I was really impressed by your cigar. I want you to know." He says, "You think that's impressive?" He had just come back from a vacation somewhere in the south. He said, "I brought this back." And he reaches under and pulls out. It's one of those medieval, wicked-looking spiked balls on a chain.
A mace.
Said, "This is for my staff meeting." And puts it down on the table. He's a very, very funny dude. And that's a good point of connection. So, one of the next invitations from Russell is there is going to be a meeting of the directors of the New England Vocational Rehabilitation Agency, that is voc rehab and commissions for the blind in the 6 New England states. And it's in Worcester, a 2-day meeting, and he invites me to come, and on the second day wants me to talk about this independent living and connection with civil rights and the rest of that. Okay, so I go to this meeting, and it's, dingy hotel in Worcester, and they're meeting down in the basement, and it's all rather grim and gray, and I stay well on the edge, and there they are all assembled talking about their different forms and this and that. I said, whoa, I gotta go do something else. So I went up to my room, and I was smoking at the time, I think it was Mishmakan. It was this very fine, intense, edgy weed. It was. So I get myself toked up. Woo. So I'm rushing, and I say, okay, now just for the pure interest, I will see if my perception is different of going back down to that. No, it's still the grim gray room with people talking boring shit, but I suppose I'm looking at sparkling lights glinting on, whatever, I'm sitting on the side, still distant. And Russell comes over and he taps me on the shoulder. Come on. Out of here. Oh, okay. So we go on out, and Russell says, let me get you something to drink, a Coke or something. And we go up to his room. He said, it's a chance for us to have a talk, young people coming into this scene like to have a chance to have a talk with you. So we go up to Russell's room, and I am really rushing on this weed. So I get myself out on the bed and start stretching. I'm just kind of doing stretching stuff. And so Russell says something about it. Again, I just thought this is a good opportunity for us to really have a good conversation. So I look at him and I go, Russell, you gonna give me some feedback? And he laughs, okay, man, okay. I'll give you some feedback. He said, people say you're a heavy hitter, but they don't know what ballpark you're playing in. And I roar. I go, oh man, that's great. I'm going to go and write that one down in my diary. They don't know what ballpark I'm playing in. Well, I don't know what the ballpark I'm playing in, So that's the start of my relationship to Russell Connell. And basically, I'd go to him and say, hey, look, all you rehab guys, you go to California and you tell us the action is in California. The action is in this crowd in Berkeley and what they're doing there. Well, how about sending some of us out there? So Russell antes up the funds for the first time, and this was a number of us who were involved around the startup of the Boston Center for Independent Living. And we went out there separately. We went out there we each worked out our own way, and Noreen and I flew on out, and initially we stayed in San Francisco with Bob Fuller, who was my dear friend and mentor, who had gone on from the Center Advanced Study at Wesleyan, where I had gotten to know him, and became the president of Oberlin College. And he had then dropped out of Oberlin and made his way out there to California. Was very excited by what was going on in the disability world out there. But Bob was also at that point the president of the EST Foundation. Mit Werner Erhard, he's the president of the EST Foundation. At any rate, we have an evening, one of the coldest nights of my life is sleeping on Bob Fuller's floor in San Francisco because the houses have no insulation. This is not New England cold. This is San Francisco cold. This is the fog gets in. I think we were sleeping under a rug. We didn't even have a blanket. But the next day we go on over to Berkeley, California, settle in there, are immediately wowed on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. We've got people with disabilities are just all over the place, all different kinds of disabilities. It's gotten so, I'm with Bob at some point and say, my God, look at all the people with disabilities. He goes, what? What? He's no longer noticing. He's lived there a couple of months. People have become, they're now just part of the environment. You don't see that this is anything unusual. But basically, the peak experience of that particular trip is that Ed Roberts is the newly appointed director of rehabilitation for the state of California. Ed Roberts, the great legend of the disability movement, has been appointed by Jerry Brown to be the commissioner of rehabilitation, the agency that had once said that he was too severely disabled to have any vocational potential. And Ed is speaking at a hotel in Berkeley. It's this old wood frame, beautiful, old, 19th century hotel. And Noreen and I have borrowed a golf cart, which is one of the ways some of our Crip friends get around Berkeley, is these golf carts, throw a chair on the back. But we've gotten a little distracted and we get there too late to hear Ed give his speech. But Ed and I get together after, and there's a fireplace, in this side room, and I just remember Ed and I are sitting there by the fireplace and, kind of making connection. And Ed is talking about how much his life has changed now as commissioner of rehab. And he is now able to get just very fine quality tie sticks. His cannabis game has come to another. Were we stoners? Yeah, we were. And to some people in Berkeley, the extent to which Ed did that was an issue over time. But when I got back to Boston and reported in to Russell about my first meeting with Ed Roberts, I said, yeah, Russell, and he's telling me about now these tie sticks he's able to get. And Russell said, oh my God, the first time I saw that man take a toke, I was so concerned. Russell is not anyone, for whom cannabis hadn't touched his lips, God knows, but it was not the world that he lived in. And he sees this long, lean, just thin little rail of a quad guy in some way. One of Ed's personas to me, he had now a portable respirator, which he hadn't had when he was young, but it came up from under his chair, so he would suck on that thing. So Ed was a hookah smoking caterpillar. Ed was, he was a California dude. And this great pairing between Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann. Ed was the California dude, and Judy Heumann is Brooklyn. Judy Heumann is fast, focused, tough, boom. And Ed was, I'm going to tell you a story. And you know what the story is about? It's about me. So, that's the story. Because this is also for a whole lot of folks out there in the world of the disability movement we lost Ed Roberts a long time ago. So he's a name that has that quality of legend, the great Ed Roberts, who is one of the defining figures. Judy and I had the good fortune of knowing him well, calling him brother, spending good time with him. And I've been thinking about what's been written about him, what's known about him, what is not known about him. And if we were to do an American Masters, do some kind of a documentary that was going to begin to tell the story of Ed Roberts, well, where would I begin? Thinking of it as a screenplay. And for me, there is a compelling central episode, and that is Ed flying from Oakland, California to Washington, D.C. with no respiratory support to go to the first conference that was going to look at the allocation of federal monies for at-risk students, promoting, bringing at-risk students into higher education. That threw me off. Here's the story, okay? What people don't know about Ed Roberts is, he tells the story this way, right? He's got polio when he's 14. He spends time in rehab. Now he's back home, living with his mom and his dad. His dad works for the railroad. They are blue collar people. They live simply. He's sleeping in the dining room. He's connected to school by a rugged little microphone setup. That's it. And his mom comes to him one day and says, "I need to have a life. You have to start going to school." And Ed goes, "Oh, shit, no." That's terrifying to him. At that point, he said, what really scares him is this idea that people are going to stare at him. And Mama Zona, no excuse, you are going to start going to school. And that first day of school, Zona loads him into a station wagon. He's just a rail of a guy, 120 pounds, pushing on 6 feet tall, thin little guy in this long chair. And they drive into one of those California high schools where everybody is out having lunch in the open air, and they drive up into the middle and get him out of, and so his worst nightmare comes true. People are staring at him. Oh my God, what's he gonna do? And Ed's own story is he says at that moment, he decides he can be a star. He does not have to think of himself as this. He thinks of himself with all this attention that he's a star. So this great gregarious personality emerges. He's charming, he's bold, he's all of that. He gets through high school. There is a famous first fight. It's time for him to graduate high school, and they deny him his high school degree because he hasn't completed physical education or driver's education. So Mama Zona, who's the one who teaches him how to fight, Mama Zona is the one who steps up and does the fight with this assistant superintendent and whatever idiot bureaucrats have decided they are not going to give him his degree easily. And it's easy enough, right? They're going to have a meeting of the school board. Mama leads the fight. Ed gets his degree. It's time to move on. Now, here's the story that is not known about Ed Roberts. He goes on to the College of San Mateo. They live in San Mateo. And at the College of San Mateo is this remarkable woman, Jean Worth. And Jean Worth, amongst her other distinctions, she's brilliant, she's politically engaged, she's a remarkable human being, PhD in English, but she's also 6'5". And she got that height at a very young age. Her father was a distinguished doctor setting up cancer clinics, and Jean had had the experience of a whole lot of unwarranted medical attention. She was inspected, injected, stripped, all of that thing. What's going on that this young woman is becoming so tall? It became this kind of, she was on the vertical and Ed was on the horizontal, this great relationship of Jean as his advisor and mentor. He goes through the College of San Mateo. She becomes a great family friend. And it comes time for San Mateo becomes one of the schools that really starts moving towards integration. It starts moving in some of the finest programs of finding at-risk students of color and bringing them in and giving them support. And the person who leads that is Jean Worth. The reaction sets in California, though, and suddenly with Ronald Reagan ascending to the governorship, you've got highly armed SWAT squads taking over the campus, destroying this decisive, innovative programs that Jean is putting together. It's that kind of crisis. This is around the time, just around the time, Ed Roberts is going to graduate. And he has a meeting with Mama Zona and Ed with Jean. And Mama's thinking, oh, this is great. Ed's got an associate's degree. He'll come home now. He's become a good writer. Maybe he'll become a freelance writer, and he'll do that from home and then go in for this meeting. And Zona is flabbergasted when Jean asks, well, what are you thinking of doing next? And Ed says, I'm thinking of going on in political science. And they've got a program down at UCLA, down in Southern California, in veterans. And Jean goes, no. If you're going on in political science, you're going to Berkeley. Berkeley is where the first-rate political science program is in the California system. You're going to Berkeley. So this movement of Ed Roberts crossed the bay to be the first student with that level of really complex disability. It is Jean Worth who is the mentor, who brings him over there. They go look for the housing, all of the adventures, because Ed sleeps in his 800-pound iron lung. Where are you going to put that? And there are stories that unfold about that. There's a wing of the campus hospital where he takes over an entire floor for himself, and it's Ed with basically mouth controls to a phone system, isolated on this wing of hospital at night, the first student. Then that it opens up, they start bringing in other students with disabilities, and these are the legendary rolling quads. It gets to be a group of 7 guys and the first woman who comes in, and they are the rolling quads of Cowell Hospital. So this is the breakthrough. This is the modest cutting edge that becomes the disability movement. Ed has gotten his undergraduate degree. He's gotten a master's degree. He's actually moved out and doing some teaching. And this is the point at which Jean Worth's program is destroyed, actually. Ed's had his couple of years at California. But late wave anti-poverty money has come in. So for the first time, there's going to be funding for particularly racial integration of, bringing at-risk students into higher ed. And a man calls Jean from Washington and says, I'd like you to come and be part of this first, conference that's going to set up the guidelines on how we're going to basically allocate and disperse this money. It's unfortunate, though, that we've got this 10%, 12% set aside. We've got to deal with cripples. And it's terrible. They're making me deal with the cripples. And Gene Worth said, oh yeah? Well, I got the guy for you. So this first Washington-based conference, it's a pretty decisive point in new higher ed programs. Ed Roberts flies from Oakland to Washington with no respiratory support. Now, this is the hard thing to grasp. Ed is post-polio. The only return he had is one little flick in a couple of fingers and in a toe. He has no respiratory support. But what they had found in the rehab process is some people learn what's called glossopharyngeal breathing or frog breathing. It's actually swallowing air using the jaw and mouth structure and upper neck to swallow air. That's how he breathes on a 3,000 airline trip. I'm reading this in the oral history. I called Ed's mama, Zona, who is still alive today. She was then about 90. And I asked her, I said, the way I read this, Ed made this trip, no respiratory support. She said, absolutely, it was terrifying. He had, his brother flew with him, but there's no respirator, no support. It is, so the way I would set this movie of Ed Roberts' life would be on that plane flight. You see him in profile, see the subtle look of this process of, and then what goes on in terms of the mental process. I suppose you can go both backwards and forwards. This becomes the defining point at a certain level on this breakthrough in education for people with disabilities. But it's also this, boy, people don't think Ed Roberts was a hero. But the story, in Washington, Gene Worth has found Ed sleeps in an iron lung. She has found an iron lung. But she discovers the collar, the seal that makes the iron lung effective. This is old and worn out and dried and cracked. So while Ed is flying cross country, Jean is desperately rushing around Washington. She's found a guy with a kind of an engineering background, a kind of a can-do everything character, and the two of them are out finding materials, stitching this together, basically when Ed lands, to be able to actually get him into the iron lung. The iron lung, for people may not understand, unlike positive ventilation that pushes air into the lungs, what an iron lung does is forming a seal around the whole body. It creates a negative pressure. It withdraws pressure from the entire capsule of the iron lung, and that's what lets the lungs expand and support the breathing. It's the inverse. And Ed just never, at least in his younger days, never wanted to go to a trach or anything that was positive air ventilation. For him, it was to sleep, his comfort measure was to sleep in an iron lung. So Gene Worth manages to pull that together in Washington, only the hotel where the conference is being held won't let them bring the iron lung into the hotel. So they have to find another place nearby. So it's that layered story of this extraordinary man, this extraordinary journey. his extraordinary mentor, and the origins from that flight, from that moment, the disability movement springs.